On Thursday, the Scottish Government published a new paper called Your Right to Decide, setting out its plan to secure a second independence referendum for Scotland. In the 22-page paper, and in a complimentary speech, First Minister and Scottish National Party leader John Swinney said that it's for the people who live in Scotland alone to make the choice about the future of Scotland as a country. The SNP has made clear that it's going into the rapidly approaching Scottish Parliament election, due in May next year, seeking a mandate for another referendum. But after several of the most tumultuous years in the SNP's 18 years governing Scotland, how viable is its approach? In this video, we're going to explore the SNP's independence strategy, whether this new paper changes things, and the prospect of another referendum. Dive deeper into politics with our magazine Too Long. Yes, we make a real physical magazine. In the latest issue, we discuss if Starmer just has no vision for Britain, if Farage can become Prime Minister, and ask if we're observing the end of the American order. Find out more by clicking the link in the description. We're going to start by looking at what the SNP's independence strategy has been since the 2014 referendum. Despite the independence movement's loss in 2014, a series of major events and factors kept it alive and kicking, including Brexit, which Scotland strongly voted against, the rise of Boris Johnson's Conservative government, which was deeply unpopular in Scotland, the heightened profile of First Minister Nicola Sturgeon during the COVID pandemic, and more. The 2016 and 2021 Scottish Parliament elections resulted in majorities for pro-independence parties, i.e. the SNP and Scottish Greens combined. The 2019 general election saw the SNP win 48 out of Scotland's 59 seats, and every published opinion poll on independence conducted between June 2020 and January 2021 had yes ahead of no, representing the most sustained polling lead for the independence camp ever. Starting in 2017, the SNP-led Scottish Government made several attempts to secure a second independence referendum by requesting that the UK Government transfer powers to the Scottish Parliament via what's called a Section 30 order, so that it could legislate to hold an independence referendum, which is how the 2014 referendum happened. But consecutive Conservative Prime Ministers shot down these calls, saying it was not the time for another referendum, and that the 2014 vote had been a once-in-a-generation event. Beginning in 2022, the Scottish Government began publishing a series of papers called Building a New Scotland, sort of a prospectus for an independent Scotland, focusing on a range of policy areas. It was in June 2022 that Sturgeon launched her biggest push yet, announcing her intention to hold an independence referendum in October the following year. The plan involved asking the UK Supreme Court to rule on whether the Scottish Government has the power to hold a referendum without UK Government approval. If yes, the vote would go ahead as planned. If no, the SNP would treat the next UK general election as a de facto referendum, i.e. if a majority of Scottish votes went to pro-independence parties, the Scottish Government would treat that as a mandate to pursue negotiations on independence with the UK Government. In November 2022, the Supreme Court unanimously ruled that a referendum could not be held without the UK Government's permission. But Sturgeon's de facto referendum strategy ultimately didn't really come to anything. It was watered down by the SNP under her successor Humza Yousaf, and by the time of the general election in July 2024, the SNP, by then led by John Swinney, suffered a disastrous result, falling from 48 seats to just 9, and dropping to second behind Labour in seat and vote share. Under Swinney's leadership, it had at times seemed like independence had been put on the back burner. He scrapped the post of Minister for Independence, disbanded the Scottish Government's dedicated independence unit, ended the Building a New Scotland paper series, and Prime Minister Keir Starmer claimed that Swinney had not raised the idea of a second referendum with him in their discussions. However, over the course of this summer, and with a newly published paper, Swinney has now sought to bring the independence issue back into focus by setting out his own new strategy and criticising those of his predecessors. Essentially, Swinney's pitch is this: forget general elections and forget de facto referendums, let's get back to the one and only thing that has ever resulted in an independence referendum, an SNP majority in the Scottish Parliament. Swinney makes the argument that a precedent was set in 2011, when the SNP won its first and only outright majority in the Scottish Parliament, prompting the UK government to allow an independence referendum to be held in 2014. He points out that both the 2016 and 2021 Scottish Parliament elections, which resulted in pro-independence majorities but not outright SNP ones, failed to bring about a referendum. So, in order to, quote, break the logjam, the SNP needs to repeat its 2011 success at next year's Scottish election by winning an outright majority, and then, pointing to the 2011 precedent, seek UK government approval for a referendum. But this strategy shares the same fundamental weakness as previous SNP strategies, in that it relies entirely on the government in London to say yes. And given the UK's constitutional setup, there is nothing the SNP can really do about that, besides trying to hold a Catalonia-style wildcat referendum that the party has always ruled out. Yes, the paper puts forward a number of points, that there's a precedent, that the UK is a voluntary union, and that a generation has now passed with 1 million people eligible to vote by 2030 who were too young to vote in 2014. But at the end of the day, it's up to the UK government, and while it's certainly not impossible that Labour says yes, Keir Starmer has never shown any indication that he will. But before even getting to that point, the SNP would have to win a majority of seats at next year's Scottish elections, which is a huge uphill challenge. While the SNP is still polling in first place, it's polling considerably below what it scored in 2016 and 2021, when it failed to secure outright majorities. But Swinney may be hoping that by recentering the issue of independence and framing an SNP majority as the ultimate mandate, he can shore up the SNP's support and bring back independence-minded voters that may have turned away from the party in recent years amid various scandals and governing fatigue. After all, independence is more popular than the SNP. Swinney's independence strategy is set to be a hotly debated topic at this month's SNP conference, as several local branches are pushing for a more radical approach, with an amendment to Swinney's own motion that would essentially bring back the de facto referendum idea and lower the threshold for a proclaimed mandate to include the seats of other pro-independence parties, such as the Greens and Alba. As we wrap up though, it's worth zooming out a bit. While we're certainly not predicting the imminent collapse of the UK, it's remarkable that if the SNP remain first in Scotland and Plaid Cymru win in Wales, as polls have suggested, the largest parties in each of Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland would be ones that seek separation from the UK, suggesting a sense of deep disillusion at the state of the Union. Now, when you're diving into complicated topics such as this, it's quite easy to get caught up in what you know without even missing a beat. But what about the stories you don't see? Or what happens when the stories you do see are purposefully leaving out information to try and sway your thinking? Thankfully, our sponsor this week, Ground News, are experts at helping with just that. Ground News is a website and app that collects thousands of articles from around the world and puts them all in one place for you to easily compare how news is being covered by different outlets online. For each and every story, you can see the number of sources reporting on it, as well as the political bias, factuality, and ownership of said sources. For example, if we take this story on Labour's Angela Rayner housing scandal, you can see that there are 48 sources reporting on it, with 4 of them coming from the left and 2 of them coming from the right. You can even compare the headlines to see what either side is saying, with the left framing it as a complex issue in contrast to the right, which portrays the scandal as a direct threat to Rayner's political survival. That's not all though. Ground News has tons of super handy features. Our personal favourite is their blind spot feed. Here you can find stories that have been disproportionately covered by one side of the political spectrum, helping you challenge your perspective on someone else's media reality. Here at TLDR, we're passionate about helping you understand how bias may affect the media you consume, something Ground News also firmly believes in. Because of this, we're offering 40% off the Unlimited Access Vantage Plan subscription by using the link in the description or scanning the QR code on screen. You can only access this discount through our link, so make sure you go to ground.news/TLDR or click the link in the description to get started today.